Well, Mr. President, Commissioner, members of the House, it's an honor to be able to stand here for the first time. I expect to be here numerous times during the coming 6 months to address different issues. And the issue that is on our agenda at this time is Iran. And before going into the substance of that issue, let me just express our heartfelt condolences to Iran on the occasion of the tragic accident earlier today. We sincerely regret the loss of life and express our sympathy with all of those affected by this tragedy. The issue of Iran is obviously very high up on the Swedish presidency agenda. That has to do with the outcome of the election and the question marks, to put it very mildly, that were raised after that election, as well as the political developments that we have seen since then. I think you are all aware of the fact that the European Union has taken a very strong and a very principled stand when it comes to these events. We have reiterated that questions over the conduct of elections are issues for the Iranian authorities to truly investigate and clarify. We have also been very clear in our response to what we have seen happening on the streets of Tehran. We have condemned the crackdown, the violence, the use of force, the use of force that we have seen against peaceful demonstration, condemned the crackdown against journalists, media outlets, communications and protesters. Those are contrary not only to the norms and values that we represent, but also obviously to the wishes for a more open and more reform-oriented society expressed by so many Iranians. That being said, we remain in our principled policy of wishing another, a better, a new relationship with the nation of Iran. It's a rich nation that has much to contribute to the development of the world and the development of its own region. And we would hope that at some point in time, hopefully not too distant, there will be that possibility for a truly new relationship. Before concluding, let me just note one issue that has been occupying us quite a lot, and that is that the Iranian authorities did detain a number of personalities that are staff members of European missions, as well as some European nationals. We have been in constant touch with the Iranian authorities over these issues. We consider possible accusations levelled against them to be baseless, and I can assure you that we will continue to engage with the Iranian authorities in all the ways we can until these issues are resolved in the satisfactory manner they should, that is, that the persons in question are released. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. President in office. I turn now to Commissioner Ashton. 5 minutes, please, madam.
Ovviamente con un po' di flessibilità.
Obviously, we'll be a bit flexible as far as you're concerned.
President, and this is my first opportunity to congratulate all honourable members on their election to the new European Parliament. I can say on behalf of the Commission we very much look forward to a constructive cooperation with you, including, of course, on some of the most pressing international challenges that we face. And the subject of today's debate is certainly one of those. My colleague Benita Ferrero-Waldner is travelling this week, and so I have offered and been delighted to be able to speak on her behalf in the Parliament today. This Parliament plays an important part in maintaining and developing relations between the European Union and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Exchange visits between the Parliament's Iran delegation and members of the Majlis have already played an important role in increasing mutual understanding. Parliament has also played its part in setting up several instruments that serve as important bases for EU activities in Iran, and we in the Commission hope to continue to make good use of these in the years ahead. But today's debate was prompted by the recent Iranian presidential elections and the subsequent events. While, as the Presidency has said, the evolution of Iran's politics and policies are chiefly a matter for the citizens of Iran, There can be no doubt their broader significance, and it is right that we should follow these developments closely. The European Union has taken very clear positions on the situation in Iran following the presidential elections and has remained united in these positions. We have expressed full respect for the sovereignty of Iran, but have stressed our deep concern about the post-election violence, as we would when lives are lost or rights are put at risk in any country. Allegations of European interference in the Iranian elections or any involvement in the protests which followed are unfounded. However, suppression of peaceful demonstrations, arbitrary detentions and severe censure of the media constitute violations of human rights which cannot be considered matters confined to the domestic affairs of any country. In spite of the current delicate situation in Iran, the Commission believes strongly in maintaining a dialogue. That was the case before the elections, and it remains the case now. The European Union and Iran have many common and pressing interests, including the fight against drug trafficking and support to Afghan refugees. These demand our continued attention and cooperation, and we hope that Iran will share this view. The Commission continues to search for ways to deploy community instruments in constructive activities in Iran. We can increase mutual understanding by continuing, for instance, our cooperation through Erasmus Mundus academic exchanges. We are convinced that the European Union should keep all available channels of communication open with Iran. We should strive for engagement with Iran at all levels. When possible and prudent, we stand ready to continue and expand cooperation in the future. Our present differences with the government of Iran are many. Some are very serious. We call on the government of Iran to join us in trying to find solutions to our differences through dialogue. It's only through discussing the challenges that lie between us in a spirit of mutual respect that we can hope to overcome them. Europe has never closed the door to such discussions, and it remains open today. And finally, President, I join with the Presidency in expressing condolences to the families of Iranians and Armenians who were the tragedy and the plane crash today.
Grazie.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we come to the group spokesman. First of all, Mr. SARYUSZ-WOLSKI. 2 minutes, please, sir.
Grazie, Presidente. I want to reflect the tone of debate in the extraordinary outgoing Foreign Affairs Committee, which met exactly last Wednesday, because the new one had not yet time to be convened. Everyone knows the facts all too well, so I'm not dwelling on that. The Union has a duty to stress the universality of human rights, to follow up human rights violations in Iran very closely, and to call Iran to task for the brutality and violence. We, as Foreign Affairs Committee and delegation of Iran, last week we met with representatives of the civil society of Iran, and this is the aspect which seems to us extremely important. We fully endorse the statements and positions taken so far by the Presidency, Council and the Commission. But we are also asking the Council to ensure that EU Member States and their ambassadors in Tehran are fully complying with the EU guidelines on human rights defenders and on the prevention of torture. We also should convey to the Commission our insistence that all available means should be deployed to support and strengthen civil society organisations in Iran, notably via the European Instrument on Democracy and Human Rights, to deploy all efforts for renewed engagement with Iranian civil society in such uncontroversial areas like the fight against narco traffic, refugee issues, academic exchanges, visits to Europe by journalists, to name but a few. They could help to further people-to-people contacts and lead to improved freedom of expression in the country. Pressure on human rights, yes, but no isolation. Dialogue, even if a very difficult dialogue. We are going through a very difficult and tense period with Iran. The crucial nuclear question is on hold. And we ask our question, what way forward? Well, sanctions are one possible measure being explored. We really believe the Union must find a way to re-engage with Iran in dialogue on all these issues. The need to find ways of building fresh trust and to create a strong diplomatic process has never been greater than now. We should offer our full support to the Council and Commission in their efforts. In turn, we, the European Parliament, must continue with our efforts to strengthen the parliamentary diplomacy aspect of our relations with Iran through our strengthened links with the MILLAN. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole SARYUSH-WOLSKI.
Thank you, Mr. SARYUSH-WOLSKI. You, of course, were speaking on behalf of the EPP group. Now we give the floor to representatives of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Mr. Howitt. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, President. Whatever people feel about the outcome of the Iranian elections, there is no doubt that tens and hundreds of people have been injured, tens of people have been killed in the protests that have taken place since the elections in that country, and that into thousands of people appear to have been detained as political prisoners. And therefore this chamber, right across this chamber, should have no hesitation in condemning those abuses of human rights, as it should condemn the obstructions to free journalism that have taken place since the elections. We should also, as Mr. SARYUSH-WOLSKI referred to from the Foreign Affairs Committee last week, recognise that the best way, one of the best ways of determining a free and fair election is to invite in election monitors to observe the process, and this European Union has got a fine record of doing that. And we should note in this chamber today that the European Commission, on all our behalf, did not have the confidence that they could do an independent and fair and objective job, and therefore we have a proper reason to say that we have no confidence in the election results. President, our hearts go out to the Iranians who have been injured, detained and are having their human rights abused. Our thoughts are foremost with them. But I ask this chamber too to put our thoughts to the Iranian who was an employee of the British Embassy, who has been detained and is charged with fomenting the protests in a completely unjustified way, and that we say our hearts should go out too to the French student who was detained by the Iranian authorities. And we should praise our colleagues in the Swedish presidency who have stood by those countries and who have ensured concerted action by the European Union in response, and asked them to continue it. Finally, I am ashamed in this debate that the British National Party will speak for the first time with an MEP who last Friday described Islam as a cancer that should be removed from Europe by chemotherapy, unquote. That does not represent British people's views. That is not Europe's attitude towards Islam, and we should stand out against that as we stand out against unfairnesses internationally.
Grazie, onorevole Howitt.
Thank you, Mr. Howitt. We move on to the group of the Alliance and Liberal Democrats for Europe, Mrs. NEYTS-UYTTEBROECK.
President in office, colleagues, Iran is a large country with a big, predominantly youthful population, a long history and an impressive culture. On top of that, Iran is also located in one of the most neuralgic areas in the world. For all of these reasons, but also for reasons of simple compassion, nothing that goes on in Iran leaves us indifferent. The European liberals are no proponents of forced regime change. What we do believe is that all the peoples of the world, including the people of Iraq, have to have the right to elect their own leaders and to replace them when they are no longer fit for purpose. Under the present regime, elections in Iran do not live up to international standards for free and fair elections. It was no different at the most recent presidential elections. But even within the strict limitations that exist in Iran, large swathes of the population have not accepted the official results and have taken to the streets to protest. The recount of the results did not convince the Iranian population of its validity, and so the protests continued. This protest was suppressed in a particularly violent manner, and suppression continues. We resolutely condemn the reprisals, the persecution and call upon the Iranian authorities to put a stop to them immediately and to release the prisoners. The persecution of foreign journalists and NGO staff, including Iranian staff in foreign embassies in Tehran, must be stopped forthwith. Colleagues, President in Office, Commission, a regime that in this way turns against its own population and its own youth loses all legitimacy, not just at domestic level but at international level too. It is particularly tragic that these dramatic events are unfolding at a juncture when the President of the United States is showing willing to engage in a dialogue with Iran. Iran is in the process of missing out on a historic opportunity to take a place on the world stage which is worthy of its history and culture. Thank you.
Grazie, signora.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking to your speaking time as well. Now we move on to Mr. Cohn-Bendit on behalf of the group he chairs, the Greens EFA.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, sir.
Madame la Commissaire, Messieurs les Présidents.
Commissioner, Madam President, colleagues, when people want to free itself, we tend to show it admiration and solidarity, and that is the case for the Iranian people. Now, it's true that the elections were fraudulent at their basis, but even in these elections, we've seen that the Iranian people were able to find the way to express their desire for freedom and democracy. Now, it's true that we have interest, and of course, no one calls that into question. We have to have a dialogue that continues with the terrorist people in power in Iran. Nevertheless, we cannot simply go to business as usual. What has happened in Tehran is awful. Torture happens on a daily basis in Iranian prisons. Not only British citizens, but also Iranian citizens. Men and women are tortured on a daily basis in Iranian prisons. And with that in mind, I think Europe has to speak out. I know it's difficult to strike a balance between the interests of the Iranian people and defending their interests, and defending our interests that are not always the same. I know it's a very complicated matter, but we have to underline the fact that we stand side by side with the Iranian people. So I'd like to ask the Commission and the Council to analyse the participation and responsibility of Nokia and Siemens in the repression of the Iranian people, and the responsibility of European weapons in repression of the Iranian people. After all, it isn't possible for it to be major European companies who were used by those in power to repress the people and their desire for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cohn-Bendit. You actually saved us 10 seconds at the end there. Our next speaker is Mr. Stevenson on behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformists. 1.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, President. President, while we sit here debating the recent uprising in Iran, do we realise that over 50 of the student leaders, the protesters who were arrested, have been taken out and hanged by the Iranian authorities? That over 200 people were killed on the streets, including Neda, who has become an international and very potent symbol of the brutality against the people of Iran by that fascist regime. And while we continue to enjoy our place as the biggest trading partner with the Iranian government, do we seriously think that money is more important than lives? Why are we not prepared to put tougher sanctions in place? Why don't we as a parliament scrap our delegation for relations with Iran, which in any case in the last 5 years became nothing more than a compliant mouthpiece on behalf of the Iranian embassy in Brussels and brought shame on the EU institutions? Scrap it and let's start talking tough with the Iranian authorities. It's the only language they understand.
Grazie, onorevole Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Our next speaker is Mr. Scholz from the European United Left, Nordic Green Left. 1 minute, sir.
Thank you very much, President, Madam Commissioner, Ministers, colleagues. The GUI-NGL group is deeply concerned about the ongoing violence in Iran, and we also strongly condemn the brutal mistreatment of demonstrators. We are highly concerned about those who have been detained illegally, and we call upon them to be immediately released. We also think that the European Parliament as a whole should call for that. We also criticise comments from media and governmental circles in other countries who are instrumentalising what the Iranian citizens are doing. And certainly nothing justifies any military attack. We reject any such approach, and we therefore welcome Obama's clear words where Israel has not given a green light to attack Iran. The American president is also in favour of diplomacy. Iran is sovereign. Its people can decide for itself on its developments. The government of a sovereign state has to take up the wishes for change and pursue a political solution.
Grazie, onorevole Scholz.
Thank you, Mr. Scholz. Our next speaker is Mr. Provera from the group of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy for 1.5 minutes, please. Thank you, President, and congratulations on your election. Repression of those citizens protesting about the outcome of the elections, censorship in the media, persecution of the opposition, these all prove that there's no democracy in Iran. Similar situations can be found in other parts of the world, like China. But in Iran there are further reasons for us to be worried. First of all, their desire to be a regional superpower, shown in their interference in the affairs of neighbouring countries. I'm thinking of Basra in Iraq and their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. Secondly, the powerful influence that religious extremism has on political power in the Islamic Republic. Not long ago, a singer was sent to 5 years in jail for insulting Islam, and there have been some young people sentenced to death. President Ahmadinejad has often declared that the destruction of the State of Israel is the main goal of his policy. Furthermore, we are concerned about Iran's desire to develop a nuclear program exempt from any kind of international oversight. Bearing in mind that Iran is one of the main producers of oil and gas in the world, their real goal seems to be developing a nuclear weapon with the power that would give them to influence the rest of the area and indeed the whole of the international community. So we need, President, to have an intensive effort in Europe in order to find an appropriate counterbalance to the regime of the Ayatollah and support the moderate and reformist Iranian movements. We should mobilise the financial resources in the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights to this end, and to support all of the victims of the ongoing oppression. However, no political intervention will work without unity of action and burden sharing in Europe. Thanks very much.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mr. Provera, says the President. And I'd like to just thank you for your maiden speech. I'm being a bit indulgent with the time since it's the maiden speech of many colleagues this afternoon. And that's a comment I make to everybody. But please try and stick to your speaking time if you can. Now I turn to Krisztina MORVAI from the non-attached members. 2 minutes, madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As a human rights lawyer with 20 years experience internationally, let me ask this Parliament to please, in order to have legitimacy and credibility to scrutinise the human rights situation in third world and other non-EU countries, to please take a much closer look at the situation of democracy, the rule of law and human rights within the EU, in particular my own country, Hungary. Let me share with you a couple of facts. On the 23rd of October 2006, there was a major demonstration with about 100,000 people in commemoration of the 1956 revolution. This was organized by the largest opposition party, Fidesz, that is well represented here in the EPP, and they basically won the elections this year in Hungary. It was a middle-class crowd of families, elderly people, children, and the brutal Hungarian police brutally attacked this crowd with tear gas, with rubber bullets, with policemen on horseback, causing the injuries, severe injuries of several hundred people. On the same occasion, several hundred people were illegally detained and tortured in prison. Ever since that date, in the last 3 years, all the way up to the most recent days when 216 peaceful demonstrators were illegally detained and brutalized by the police, all the way through the 3 years, on every single occasion where there was an anti-government protest, not in Iran, not in China, not in Honduras, but in an EU country, Hungary, the same things happen. Mass police brutalities, illegal detentions. May I ask you to please join forces with me, and regardless to political affiliations, please help to find out what happened, find who was responsible, try to do justice to the victims, and please, as European Union, try to put an end to these mass violations of human rights within the EU in order to have the credibility and the legitimacy to scrutinize the human rights situation of Iran or whatever other countries outside the Union. Thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie, signora.
Thank you, Mrs. Morvai. I turn now to Mr. Miljan Mon. 2 minutes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about Iran. First of all, let me too express my condolences to the victims of the air crash which occurred this morning. President, I agree with many of the ideas that have been put forward on the question of Iran and its electoral process. It wasn't free, it wasn't fair, and it allowed President Ahmadinejad and the most radical elements in Iranian society to remain in power. They're stopping journalists from working, and they're trying to blame what's a domestic disturbance on international forces. They're carrying out disinformation campaigns as to mask this. But the conditions in Iran have worsened, as has the regime's image abroad. They're now split, and the regime's stability could be at risk. Questions such as oil prices are now important. If that don't go up, then the situation may well not improve. The Union needs to preserve a united front and condemn the abuses in Iran. It needs to make certain that the Iranians respect human rights and work out how we can best help non-state actors, particularly those people who want to see democratic pluralism and protection of human rights. We shouldn't let these people down, President. They're looking to us to help them. But in Iran, we should not forget the threat its nuclear program represents. It could destabilize the whole region as well as the non-proliferation system. It's highly desirable that the EU and the US continue to cooperate in this area, and I hope this will be a priority for the Swedish presidency. We need also to get China and Russia, permanent members of the UNSC, on board. Their support is necessary if we're going to find a negotiated solution to this threat. That means we have to show firmness and unity on the international stage. So I am pleased to see the G8 resolution adopted on the subject last week. What's happened in the last few weeks, colleagues, have clearly shown the radical extremist nature of the present Iranian leaders. It's clear that the international community can't allow these people to have their finger on the nuclear button. Thank you very much. Thank you, says the President. I now give the floor to Mr. MUÑIZ for 2 minutes, please. Thank you, President. Representatives of Council and Commission, this is my maiden speech in this House, and I'd like to express my pleasure that a discussion on Iran hasn't been caused because it's been on the front pages, because it's now being replaced there by China, Honduras, the G20, and unfortunately the recent executions of Sunni militants have brought this country back into the headlines. But I don't think that the page something appears on in a newspaper should determine what we look at here in this European Parliament. Our institution has a duty, and its duty is to be consistent as its powers increase as far as overseeing European foreign policy, particularly human rights policy, is concerned. That means scrutinising all of those instruments which the Union has at its disposal in this area. As far as Iran is concerned, we should not put in watertight compartments the discussion of nuclear issues and the total lack of political dialogue on human rights. Structural human rights dialogue has been suspended since 2004. We don't have a commerce, a trade and cooperation agreement with a democratic clause in it. We haven't managed to send an election observer mission, and the human rights monitoring money available for Iran is peanuts. We need to use the instruments which we have available in this Parliament. There have been some calls for a total break-off of relations with Iran. We are not in favour of that. We're against, of course, the political repression and the strangling of freedom of expression in Iran. But we don't think we should stop trying to stand up for human rights and the battle against poverty throughout the world. And if that's going to happen, President, we need dialogue, we need negotiation, we need to look at a common front and try to achieve some kind of alliance of civilizations, and I hope the Council will do that. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you. I'd now like to give the floor to Mrs. Rosbach for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The European Parliament has on numerous occasions debated violations of human rights perpetrated by this country, and we're doing this again. By looking at this, I think it's high time that we took tangible action at long last, because we're talking about people who hunger for freedom and who have, by taking to the streets, tried to show a sense of responsibility for bringing down a criminal regime. I mean, it's a kind of regime that doesn't have a place in the 21st century. We need to look at the role played by the UN Security Council. We need to make sure that the perpetrators are called to account. So Mr. Ahmadinejad should be put to an before an international court. We need to look at UN supervision of freedom, because here we can't have a delegation with Iran, which at its last meeting was transformed into a tool for the Iranian regime's parliament. We do not engage in cooperation with dictatorships. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Madam. I now give the floor to Mr. Griffin for 2 minutes.
Mr. President, I served as a monitor at commemorations for the 1956 revolution in Budapest last year, and I can confirm that Dr. Morvai is right to criticise those who fret about Iran while ignoring human rights abuses here in Europe. I trust that no members of the ECRG here will be hypocritical enough to condemn Iran for the use of violence in elections when David Cameron is among the sponsors of UAF, an organisation of far-left criminals which routinely deploys intimidation and violence against nationalist dissidents in Britain. The same is true of 5 current Labour, Lib Dem and Tory MEPs, marked with the shame of supporting the use of British taxpayers' money to support their own militia, which breaks up opposition meetings and attacks their opponents with bricks, darts and clawhammers. But my main point is this: however well-meaning and even justified criticisms made here of Iran may be, they will be exploited as war propaganda by the powerful vested interests that stand to gain from a military attack on that country. Neocons, oil companies, construction corporations and the Wahhabi mullahs of Saudi Arabia all want to see the sovereign state of Iran destroyed by an aggressive war. Not even European liberals are naive enough to fall for lies about weapons of mass destruction again, so human rights are being drafted in as a new casus belli. Do not add the voice of this place to the warmongers' chorus for a third illegal and counterproductive attack by the West on the Muslim world. Or, if you must, do not leave the war, which hypocritical rhetoric will help to justify and unleash, to the usual brave British cannon fodder. 18-year-old boys from the Mersey and the Thames and the Tyne. Instead, send your own sons to come home in boxes, or without their legs, their arms and their sanity, or mind your own business. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. And I'll give the floor to Mr. KACZMAREK for 2 minutes.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the death of innocent people is always tragic. But if they perish defending such values as freedom or truth, we can say that their suffering is not in vain. And this is the case of the recent victims in Iran. It's too bad when the regime shoots the demonstrators, imprisons dissidents, tortures and kills them. We can only hope that those events will make politicians and the general public realize the true nature of the Iranian regime. A regime capable of ignoring the minimum standards of the modern world. It's a regime with blood on their hands. We should bear it in mind and act so as to change what we cannot accept. The question is, what can we do? We can support the demands and proposals that have already been put forward. First, the Iranian authorities must stop violence against the dissidents. The international community must also monitor and guarantee respect for human rights. Second, Iran should organize free and fair elections. Such elections should allow all candidates to stand, not only those that are permitted by the authorities. Incidentally, those who decide about the ability of others to stand do not possess a democratic mandate. The fairness of the elections must be verified by independent external observers. Third, we should do everything we can to ensure that any solutions are of peaceful and political nature. And this means that we should support those Iranians that want change which will lead to fair elections, so that Iran stops being a threat to global security. Mrs. Rajavi, a leader of the Iranian opposition, said that the events in Iran amounted to the beginning of the end of the regime. I do hope that she is right.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to MAURO.
Grazie, signor Presidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank the Swedish presidency for the opening remarks before our debate, which I think were very well balanced and help us understand the responsibility we have to shoulder. And in that connection, I'd like to make a comment based on what I've seen on the television screens and what's motivated the demonstrations recently. Now, if it's true that Iran is a theocracy where fundamentalism has claimed its right to power on behalf of God, we've seen people taking to the streets crying, God is great. But it's very different if you look at people's faces and what they want to do and the fact that they're determined to pursue a path of non-violence. This shows us that in Iran there's a love of freedom and peace. and the fact that it's important to respect everyone's destiny. So there hasn't been enough for 30 years of theocracy, 30 years of destruction of human rights to cancel the memory of something that's in each of our hearts. And I think that's what we need to be true to. This love of the truth, love of freedom. We have to devote ourselves to that. We all have a responsibility. We're asking European institutions to be strong, to make ourselves heard. But it isn't just about geopolitics. But it's very important to show that the European institutions who want a united Europe have to respect this love of freedom and love of truth that everyone's had in their hearts who've taken to the streets the last few days. Thank you, Mr. Mauro. And now give the floor to Mr. KELAM for 2 minutes.
Presidente.
Thank you, President.
A crucial change has taken place in Iran. Our first conclusion, therefore, should be that Iran is not and will not be the same again. It is because millions of Iranians have refused to be hostages of their clerical rulers. They have demonstrated an amazing courage to challenge the dictatorship. The issue, therefore, is not about rigging so-called elections more than usual. This time, blatantly rigged vote provided an outlet for a popular protest the experts outside Iran could not or were willing not to expect. This reminds me of the situation 20 years ago in Eastern Europe. While the Western governments were prepared for a long-time accommodation and pragmatic coexistence with the Soviet totalitarian system, suddenly millions of hostages of the communist regime became active. They challenged the system, which was brought to a sudden end. Therefore, it is important to realize that the European approach to Iran cannot remain the same, just looking aside from routinely rigged elections and systematic repressions. It's estimated that during 30 years of dictatorship, more than 5 million people have been imprisoned, more than 200,000 tortured to death, and recently more than 200 killed. The EU governments have been too hesitant to condemn these atrocious crimes and to make the regime bear responsibility for its behavior. If we are serious about protecting the rights of Iranian citizens, we need to be prepared to cause the dictators real pain. What does it mean? We should, for example, ban any of the leaders of the regime to travel to the EU. We should recall our ambassadors from Iran as a gesture of our indignation. And pre-elections can take place in Iran only under the UN supervision. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Mr. KELAM. Now I'll give the floor to Kolarska-BOBISKA for 1 minute.
Dear President, Madam Commissioner, colleagues, as the situation in Iran escalates and the violation of democracy presents also a danger to whole regional stability, we have to express our concern and condemnation, but declarations cannot be only symbolic and empty. Some European leaders are talking about new sanctions to be imposed on Iran. But a discussion is needed right now on the promotion of democracy at a grassroots level in this country. I am Polish, and we in Eastern Europe know how important are these type of actions for the establishment of democracy. A promotion should be adapted to political and economic situation in a given country, but previous EU experience in the promotion of democracy in North Africa, Middle East and Eastern Europe have to be reviewed and evaluated in order to see what should be done in Iran, what can be done in Iran, and what is effective under given circumstances in this country. I also want to remind you that if EU wants to be credible, it has also to undertake some measures in Moldova. Soon we will face a new test on the 29th of July elections in Moldova. EU have to do everything to ensure a free and fair democratic elections in this country. It is not enough to talk about the support for democracy. We in European Parliament and European institutions have to be more active in that respect. Thank you very much.
Well, as I say, this afternoon we are having some exceptions. We can't repeat that. Now, you can't have 35 seconds extra than 1 minute. And now give the floor to Mrs. Sonik. And can I remind you that you have 60 seconds. Thank you.
Mr. President, it is quite clear that we must look at the election process in Iran, but we must start with a declaration on the part of the Iranian authorities to stop violence and to free dissidents, journalists, demonstrators, as well as citizens of other countries that are blamed for the situation in Iran. We must respect the sovereignty of Iran, but we must also remind Iran of the need to respect the International Convention on Political and Civic Rights. And I am also afraid that Iran may exploit nuclear power for other than civilian needs. But we must make sure that its activity has peaceful character.
Thank you. Now give the floor to KOPPA.
I'd like to express my deep sorrow for the tragic airline accident which occurred in Iran this morning. The debate today is coloured, of course, by the 10th of June elections. But we need to look at this in a correct framework. We shouldn't send out mixed or wrong messages. We cannot interfere, and we shouldn't mix up the election results with Iran's nuclear program. We should be clear that the subject of our discussion is the question of democracy and human rights in Iran. And we shouldn't ever try to move the nuclear issue to the front stage and forget about the problems that the Iranian people are having. We need to continue our efforts for democratization and respect for fundamental freedoms and put together substantive political dialogue and strengthen our links with civil society. It's our duty to look into the claims that have been made about the electoral process and to make sure that the right of peaceful protest still exists in Iran as it should in every country. We should condemn the violence and make sure that the right to speak and the right of freedom of expression in Iran are respected and should be respected throughout the world. Thank you, President.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mrs. KOPPA. And now give the floor to Mr. GAHLER.
Thank you, President. I welcome the fact that we're holding this debate in the first week of the new Parliament. Unfortunately, our group presidents have opposed our motion for a resolution. A resolution would have been quite helpful in terms of bolstering the cause of people who are dissidents in Iran, because the official presidential elections in no way comply with international standards of democracy, because most of the candidates were sifted out by the Guardian Council, and so there's no way that you can say candidates enjoyed the same conditions. Now, I think it's easy to arrive at the conclusion that we need to. This election result does not reflect the will of the Iranian people. And if we want to make use of our instrument for democracy and human rights. We need to support civil society, and we have to support the efforts of those who are fighting for the rights of those who have been detained. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ulrike LUNACEK.
Danke, Herr Ratspräsident, meine
Thank you, President in Office, ladies and gentlemen. Last week, as new members, we heard Mamal Baf in the Foreign Affairs Committee, an Iranian director, film director, who said very clearly that before the election there was 20% democracy in Iran, and after the election, which he said was a coup, there's absolutely no democracy left in Iran. I also agree with his description. It was an electoral coup. There was massive electoral fraud. The majority of the Iranian people wanted a change, but their right to do so was taken away from them. President of the Council, I'm interested in one thing in particular. In the middle of August, there is going to be a celebration for Ahmadinejad. And the Council and Member States are currently discussing whether or not there will be formal official representation of the EU and the Member States at this inauguration. I hope that won't be the case, because I think after this electoral coup there should not be any official representation of the EU or the Member States, although I am in favour of further continued dialogue. But I don't think anyone should be there in an official capacity from the EU at the time of the inauguration. So I'd like to know what your position is on that and what the current thinking is on that.
Grazie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Antonio Panzeri.
Grazie, Presidente. C'è sempre il rischio.
Thank you, President. There's always a danger when we're talking about foreign policy matters, as we are today on Iran, that we're a bit behind as far as events are concerned. But there's no question that the Parliament can, if it wants to, play an important role in encouraging Europe to get involved on the international stage, taking seriously what's going on and taking initiatives to allow the Iranian process of democratization to move forward. After the spotlight swung onto Iran, after the elections and the street demonstrations which the Iranian authorities tried to quell with violence, silence seems to have fallen. But we need to keep attention focused on Iran. It's up to the presidency in office. I'd like to thank the president in office for what he said, to come up with an initiative working with the US and Russia and other countries to try to change the direction of events in Iran and look indeed at the nuclear issue as well.
Thank you, Mr. Panzeri. Thank you also for having kept to the time allocated to you. And now I'll give the floor to Mr. VIDAL-QUADRAS.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. In the last few weeks, we have seen with deep emotion the scenes of bravery and courage as the people of Iran stood up without weapons against their executioners who are armed with machine guns. The women at the head of these demonstrations clearly showed the firm commitment of the people of Iran to live in a real democracy. Mr. President in office, the response of the EU has been far too weak. It's been feeble and pusillanimous. We need to send out a powerful political signal which will show our absolute rejection of this intolerable theocratic dictatorship. The solution was pointed out by the leader of the resistance in exile. We need to depose the supreme leader and set up a temporary commission of experts who will convene elections under international supervision. Anything less will be wasting time and will prolong this shameful situation. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Vidal-Quadras.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal-Quadras. I now give the floor to Mrs. OOMEN-RUIJTEN.
Hij doet het. Voorzitter.
President, could I kick off by saying to Mr. Bildt that I extend a very warm welcome to him in his capacity as President in office. He's going to face busy months ahead because he's going to have to shoulder responsibility for all the major events in the world. Now, if we're talking about Iran, this regime is incalculable. It's difficult to figure out what its next step will be. Secondly, if you look at its religious stance, you will see that it's a theocratic government. Thirdly, if we're looking at corruption and all the things that go wrong in the world, whether we're talking about the Middle East or Pakistan, the Iranian regime supports such developments. And dialogue doesn't help. It genuinely doesn't help. And I have ascertained that citizens want more freedom, and quite rightly so. And for us as Europeans, we ought to be lending them all possible support in that. So I turn to you, Mr. Bildt, and ask a question. Why has the Council not been in a position to adopt a tougher declaration? Now, why are we continuing to stick to a course which puts business above human rights?
Thank you, Mrs. OOMEN-RUIJTEN. And I give the floor to Guerrero Salon.
Guerrero.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Let me begin, obviously, by condemning the events in Iran and the government's repression. But I also speak to endorse the remarks made by those who say that we should combine a policy of pressure with keeping up dialogue, keeping the negotiations going. History and experience show us that breaking off relations with authoritarian regimes don't help, or doesn't help, to improve the lives of citizens suffering under these regimes, and also weakens the position of those who call for the respect for democracy and human rights in said countries. So we should use all the instruments we have in the European Union to exert pressure, beginning in this House, trying to lobby the Iranian regime, but at the same time should keep negotiations and dialogue going, trying to exert pressure through dialogue, particularly through the High Representative, Mr. Solana. Thank you, President.
Grazie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Magdi Alam.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Today, Iran constitutes the main threat to security and international stability. On the one hand, by infringing UN resolutions, it's continuing to pursue nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, it is reiterating the desire to annihilate the State of Israel. I hope that Europe, under the Swedish presidency, will be able to send out a clear signal to Iran, in general terms, saying that certain things are non-negotiable, for example, the right to life, the dignity of the individual, and the dignity of the right to choose, and that cannot be left to one side in bilateral relations. Now, it's very important to clarify that the right to exist of Israel is something that's non-negotiable. Europe has experienced the Holocaust and cannot allow there to be a second Holocaust of the Israeli people and state. Thank you, Magdi Alam. Now, the last intervention before we give the floor back to the Council is Juvin.
Philippe Juvin.
Philippe Juvin.
Monsieur le Président, je souhaite prendre la parole pour deux...
Mr. President, I'd like to take the floor to ask our Assembly to speak out very clearly in favour of technical and financial sanctions against Iran. And of course, there are many arguments against sanctions which would have an impact on the lives of the Iranian people. But what is worse for Iranian people isn't shortcomings as a result of these sanctions, but what's worse is our silence, our failure to act. Mr. President, sanctions would mean that we are not indifferent, and I think that's what's the most important thing. That's why, Mr. President, our Assembly has to call for financial sanctions to be imposed on Iran. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you. There's been one further request for the floor, and I'd like to grant it. There's a wealth of contributions being made by our Parliament, and this is very important. After all, it's such a sensitive subject, an important subject. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Tannock for the last intervention before the Council.
The appalling Iranian theocratic dictatorship is already guilty of many crimes against its own people, from hanging Baha'is to homosexuals, and now apparently 50 innocent protesters. So we should hardly be surprised by the mere stealing of an election through wholesale electoral fraud. I believe this crack in the regime and the courage of its protesting youth, whom I salute, will eventually bring the whole rotten government down. Mr. Howitt recently in another meeting suggested we should have sent EU electoral observers from this House to confirm if fraud had actually taken place. No, we must never legitimise any sham election which restricts those who are the candidates on the basis of their religious purity and conducts its count before closed doors. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you. And now I'll give the floor to Mr. BILDT for concluding remarks on behalf of the Council.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I have obviously listened very attentively to the different assessments and views expressed. This is, as has been pointed out, a most important debate on a most important subject. I think it can fairly be said that we stand united in our assessment of what's been happening, what we've seen on the television screens, and more importantly, what we have heard from the people who know even more than what can be seen on the television screens. I would like to take issue with someone who said we've not been clear enough. If you make a comparison with what the European Union has said and what every other significant word body or actors have said, there is no question that we are the ones that have been the most clear, the most consistent, the strongest in the words that we have used. We would have wished those words to have more of an effect than it already has, but that is often the case. But our words are nevertheless, no question about that, important. We are discussing primarily what happened or what's been happening in Iran since the election on June the 12th. But I think it's important also to focus somewhat on what we saw on the television screens before June the 12th, because there was suddenly a somewhat different Iran from the one we were used to. There was an element within the boundaries of the regime, certainly. There was an element of vitality, an element of plurality, of pluralism, an obvious desire for change, for openness, for reform. If that represented the majority of Iranians or not is very difficult to judge from the outside, but that it was significant is testified not the least by the force of the crackdown that we've seen after June the 12th. So in condemning what we've seen after, we should not forget what we saw before and the long-term significance of that. I think we are united in what we say and what we think. Mr. SARYUSH-WOLSKI, Mr. COHN-BENDIT, Mr. MAURO, virtually the same if we look at what we assess. But the most difficult thing is, of course, not what we say. The most difficult thing is what we do in face of this situation. And I think we must then operate along sort of two lines. The first one, fairly obvious. The European Union must be the clear voice for human rights and democracy wherever and under whichever are the circumstances. There might be other factors coming into consideration of policy as well, but it should not dilute in any way from the consistency of our defence for human rights. So we must condemn the killings, the use of the death sentence. We must call for the release of those detained. We must be clear in our call for full respect for the freedom, the rights that are there for every human being in our world. But secondly, and I think in here there might be some dissent, that we must also be prepared to engage. I'm saying that recognising that that is a far more difficult policy than just to stand back, do nothing or trying to isolate. That's easy. To engage is difficult. Mr. Kelam alluded to some of the historical experience we have with the balancing act that entails. But that the fact that we have a certain amount of historical experience in Europe, reflected not the least here, perhaps makes it possible for us to venture along that particular road. We should never believe that just a diplomatic dialogue can sort out every issue that has been addressed here. It cannot. Other factors will come into that particular equation. But neither should we forget that there are some issues that we have a duty to seek to resolve through diplomatic dialogue. I'm thinking of the individuals employed at the UK Embassy or the French student, others, that we must deal with now in a dialogue. I'm coming from a country where 1% of our citizens have a background in Iran. They move back and forth. We have consular issues that are of a multitude that is difficult to fathom. We need to be prepared to engage to help individuals in different cases without believing that that is going to sort out everything at once. And we've got the nuclear dossier that has been alluded to. There might be others who believe there are far more simple solutions to that. I don't think there's any solution if we don't engage in a true diplomatic dialogue on that. There are also other issues that we need to engage on. This is obviously going to be more demanding and more difficult in the circumstances that we now have. There's no question about that. And I think the discussion that was in AFET last week highlighted some of the difficult choices and some of the difficult judgments that we must have to do in the next not only weeks but months, but not very much longer than that. And here we must engage, you, us in the Council, and us as Europeans with other significant international actors, not only with Americans, with a new and I think good approach by the Obama administration, but also engage with others, the UN Security Council, with Russia, with China, and with the wider world community. It is only then that we can hope to be able to start resolving not only the immediate issues, but also the somewhat other issues that need to be addressed. So I'm grateful for this debate. I think it has highlighted the clear unanimity that we have when it comes to defending our values, but it also highlighted some of the difficult choices and balancing acts that we have to engage in the months and the years ahead. We know what we want to achieve. We also must seek to achieve it, but don't think it's going to be easy, and I can assure you that the Council will continue to be engaged, very much engaged, with all aspects of this particular dossier.
Thank you very much, Council. I don't know whether... Yes, Mr. COHN-BENDIT.
Excusez-moi, mais on vient d'avoir...
I'm sorry, but I've just received some information. I'd like to pass it on to the Council and all my colleagues. Natalia Esterimova, who was a candidate for the Sakharov Prize in the European Parliament, has been arrested in Grozny this morning. She's been kidnapped by people we don't know. So I'd like to ask the Council and the Commission and the members of Parliament to protest so that in Moscow people know that we're thinking of her. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cohn-Bendit. I'm sure that Council and Parliament will note what you say and take the appropriate measures. The debate on Iran is closed, and Mr Howard has asked for the floor on a personal matter.
Well, just to put the record straight, as my name was cited by my colleague Mr Tannock, I did not call last week, and indeed earlier in the debate I was very clear in saying that should the circumstances have justified it, the European Union would have been able to send an observer mission to the Iranian elections, but it was precisely because the European Commission did not have confidence to do that that causes us proper, justified and objective concern about the conduct of those elections. I'm sorry that Mr Tannock wasn't in the chamber to hear that earlier in the debate, and I hope that I've been able to put the record straight.
Thank you, Mr Howard. Colleagues, the next item on the agenda are statements from Council and Commission on China. On behalf of the Council, I give the floor to Carl Bildt, the President in Office. Go ahead, sir.
Mr President, another debate of, needless to say, some importance. And although the subject is China, it of course takes place against the background of some significant development in Xinjiang in the western part of China. I know that these events have been followed by many members of this Parliament as well as our respective national parliaments throughout Europe. We have also as a Council expressed our concern over the reports over the unrest there and called for restraints on all sides and for the situation to be resolved peacefully. I think it is time to also say that we attach great importance to human rights. We also profoundly regret not only the loss of life but the destruction of property and everything else that we have seen happening, and we can only condemn those that are responsible for it, whoever they are. But let me also take this opportunity to take stock somewhat more widely of our relationship with China, a country with whom we have an extraordinary range of relationship and a complexity of those as well. In fact, when we decided in 2003 to set up those relationships within the framework of a comprehensive strategic partnership, we were committing ourselves to an extremely ambitious enterprise. And this is very much reflected in the broad and wide-ranging relationship which we have with China today. Complexity, of course, brings opportunities. It also brings challenges of different sorts. What we have tried to do with this relationship is to open it up to the point where we can discuss frankly and openly any concern that we might have on either side. The basis for such an open dialogue is the shared interest that we have in developing our relationship, our shared interest in global peace and stability. We pursue this through dialogue and through multilateralism. We have the annual summit meetings, we have fairly frequent meetings on the level of foreign ministers. We also have an intense biannual human rights dialogue, and then, of course, the sectoral dialogues that we have on different issues, trade, of course, obviously being one of particular importance. We have also the annual high-level dialogue on trade and economic issues. And as you are aware, we also in 2007 launched negotiations for partnership and cooperation agreement. Negotiations are progressing, but still there is a potential to increase efforts on both sides in these negotiations. We have a very clear interest in developing the relationship with China in all fields. And that entails, as I said, the possibility for an open and frank dialogue also on issues where our values might be different, and we know that there are those, including human rights, including issues like use of the death sentence, but also to pursue the common interest that we have, needless to say, in these days, issues of global financial stability, issues of how to do with the climate change challenge are important, but also important foreign policy issues, be that the situation we face